Okay, good morning. Today is Tuesday, June 5th, 2024. It's 8:13 a.m. Been up since 3 and almost through my coffee. I was thinking this morning again about the Jordan Peterson talk that I watched, We Who Wrestle with God. Was released on YouTube about the showing his one of his engagements where he's promoting. This is his book tour promoting the book of the same name, and it's an interesting talk. It's very deep and very scholarly. He goes to great depth to set up the case for the psychoanalyzation of humanity, basically, and takes it right into the story of Adam and Eve. And what's interesting is with all of the build-up and so forth, he lands squarely in the traditional Catholic, Protestant, Calvinistic zone of original sin, human depravity. And he does the description of Adam and Eve, and his step by step of what took place in the garden is classic. It's classic Christian. So it tells me that although he may know the Greek or the Hebrew behind some of the words that are taking place in the Genesis 1 narrative, that he still has a long ways to go in terms of understanding the bigger picture there. He doesn't mention anything about the polemic that story is with regard to the other creation stories of the same time frame. But as I was thinking about that and working on just the thought genesis in my own heart and mind about a response talk called We Who Wrestle with Principalities. And I think it would be an excellent way to set that up to almost follow the same pattern that he did. But I was thinking about the story, and I've mentioned this story before, the scenario that takes place in the garden. And so what if we just used the biblical text that we have in context as the story of what took place in the garden? The thing about context here is it's almost not relevant because the story is formative. It's first beginnings. It's first principles. It's God creates man, and he's in the garden. And there's not too much contextual nuance that has deviated or that deviates from that because it's basic. It's the origin of man. It's, this is what took place. And then we have Genesis 2. We have the creation of woman and that dynamic, and then the interplay between Adam, Eve, and the serpent in the garden. And that's where this gets twisted. And so I would like to consider doing a presentation, and I think in a graphic, a PowerPoint here would be really helpful, a dynamic PowerPoint that would show this in its basic form, and in the sense that point out that this is a first principles narrative, that the context doesn't necessarily, there's no contextual elements here. There's no polemic going on. This is more of a description, and I think that's significant because anything we add to it we're actually taking away from the meaning of what it is. So I think a reductionist view, looking at this from the most simple and direct way possible, can possibly provide the most accurate summary. And I think we can demonstrate that using this this process. So the process would be, okay, what are the characters? And then we would have and build a chart, a table with the characters. And we start with God. Then we start with Adam. Then we start with Eve, or then we list Eve, and then we list the serpent. The serpent shows up. And then we go through and we can add columns on this table and say, what do we know from the text up to this point? Literally from the text, that's all, nothing else. Up to this point about these individuals. And so we can go and list the attributes of God. And then we know about man. And we could, just from Genesis 1 and 2, about man and Eve, and just what we know about them. So we start with who the characters are, what the facts are. These are the things that we know. Now, we'll take the next step is, what can we derive from these facts based on what we know? And this is where it gets interesting, because this is what will impose the limitation on our interpretation of what happens. So we know God is God, and he has these attributes. And we know God created man, and he created woman. But one of the things about man and woman that we also know from the text up to this point is that they do not possess the knowledge of good and evil. They do not possess the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this is where it's interesting, because this is the one place that I think application of context now and understanding to what that means really gives focus to why this is there. They do not have the knowledge of good and evil, because they're actually warned against eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So that means they don't have that. And that is actually, later on in the story, precisely what the enemy uses to entice them into partaking of that fruit. So I was really like Jordan Peterson. I'm older than he is, so whatever that means. But I've been thinking about this a lot. And here's the revelation that I want to add to this. I say revelation, it's my own personal revelation. You might know this, have known this your whole life, I don't know. But the knowledge of good and evil is not something that we gain intellectually. I want you to understand that. The knowledge of good and evil isn't something that we appropriate intellectually. It can only be appropriated experientially. You cannot appropriate the knowledge of evil through a thought, only through experience. I'm not going to flesh that out right here on this little riff, but I think that's a very important point. You can't. The knowledge of evil only can be appropriated through experience. I think that's a fact. I think that's an observable reality that we can look at. I think Jordan Peterson would be hard-pressed to say that's not the case. because any concept we have of evil today, we relate to our own experience, and we're in this evil world. So we are born into an evil realm, so it has impacted and proliferates our environment. It impacts us and permeates our thinking. So we do not know how, we don't have the capacity, except in some limited cases. Maybe there's a culture somewhere. But anyway, without getting into the nuanced weeds here of that, the point is, I want to make is that, and this I guess would be my proposition, is that evil is not something that can be known without being experienced. So up to that point, so that's an assumption. That's an assumption. I'm going to say that's my assumption. As we look at this, then we assume Adam and Eve have no concept of evil. They don't know what it is. Knowledge of good and evil. Okay. That's cool. Whatever evil is, don't know what it is. I think that's a valid assumption. I think that's valid given in the creation narrative where our human beings find themselves. They find themselves created in the garden in the image of God, doing God's will. And God says, don't eat of this tree. Now, think about that in the context of what I just said. It puts this whole warning, commandment of God, if you will, not to eat of the fruit of the tree, of the knowledge of good and evil, in a whole different light. It puts it in the light of protection, that God actually is protecting Adam and Eve and saying, you don't want to eat of this, because when you do, it's going to hurt. But they don't know that because they don't know what hurt is. They don't know what evil is yet. So, okay, so we'll go along with that. So they're ignorant of evil. And knowledge is implicit. They're not even really in a place of abstract thought. They're just living and doing. So knowledge, evil, good, and evil, these are things they're not really aware of. They just know, hey, we're in the garden, we're doing what God told us to do, and life's good. Now, okay, so now let's skip on down to the serpent. Some things that we know about the serpent. Strictly from the text, from the Hebrew text. And we'll go back into the Hebrew text. And this probably is the only place where, maybe not the only place, but this is where we can derive some, I think, factual understanding by Dr. Heiser's work on who the serpent was in the garden, looking at the text and the literature and so forth. And he was a shining one. And he was probably a member of the divine council. Now that's a whole nother realm of understanding that we won't get into right here. But for the sake of argument, let's say that the serpent is actually a divine being. He is, let's just say, one of the angels in this form. He's in this form of a serpent in the garden. Now, what also can we derive? We don't know initially, other than the fact that he's there, but then he has this conversation with Eve where he entices her to eat of the fruit. Now, there are some things that we can infer from this conversation. Again, there's another assumption. I'm going to suggest that they're in the garden, that this serpent's in the garden, and there's nothing in the text to suggest that the serpent just appeared in the garden. Actually, the relaxed, without stress understanding would be that the serpent was familiar to Adam and Eve. They weren't surprised. They were like, oh, look at this. The serpent's talking to us. What's up with that? No, they just have a conversation about that. Now, why is that significant? Because Adam and Eve have no reason to suspect the serpent of anything that they're not aware of. They're not aware of evil. They trust. All they know is trust. Imply trust like a child. They're children in their minds, in their emotional framework at this point. I could also use this AI example that I have. I think that might be really interesting to bring that in. And to show how it actually answered like a teenager, but then actually made up an answer and then got mad at me. That's what it looked like. Adam and Eve did not have any guile, any ill will. There wasn't anything there. And there never was. It never entered them personally. There's nothing to suggest that that's the case. Actually, there's another telling of the story that suggests a completely different path for Adam and Eve, and that I think fits the text much better. That Adam and Eve were innocent, 100% innocent through the whole thing. For example, Eve is listening to the serpent. Eve is curious. Eve is a woman. She's curious. She's looking, she's listening, and she repeats what she heard, but she trusts the serpent. Why wouldn't she? She has no reason not to trust the serpent at this point. So she takes the fruit, takes of it, and says, here, gives it to Adam. And Adam says, you ate this. Well, the serpent said this. He trusted her. He trusted his wife. He trusted the serpent. He trusted. It was a place of God. It was the Garden of Eden, for crying out loud. Why wouldn't they trust? Why wouldn't that be a safe place? And it was a safe place. So, until the serpent. Now, think about this setup here. What we don't see and what we can. Now let's make some assumptions. Let's look at this picture. What does this look like? What this looks like and presents like is that the serpent probably had this objective on his mind earlier than this conversation, because it looks like, it presents like a case where the serpent would have been grooming Eve for such a question. This is the essence of intelligent evil. The intelligent evil looks to take advantage of the weak, looks to hurt the weak. Intelligent evil hates humanity, period. So why wouldn't it make sense? Why wouldn't that be a natural thing that if this serpent had evil intention, well, he would have had an evil intention a day earlier, an hour earlier, a day earlier, or whatever. And to come out so cunningly smooth, and for Eve to be so at ease in that conversation, presents just like the case of someone being groomed for abuse or worse. That's just what that looks like. And so they were innocent. Eve didn't yield to some kind of sinful desire. Eve was being Eve. Adam wasn't just trying to please his wife and blah, blah, blah. Adam was just being Adam. Trusting his wife. Trusting his environment. They were deceived. And then God shows up. And that deceived, what do they have? Now they have knowledge of good and evil, but they don't understand what that means. See, that knowledge that they have isn't abstract thinking like we have about it, like we think about it. It's knowledge. They're aware of it. They've sensed it. They sense these things. Now they have emotions. They have awareness. They know they've been betrayed somehow, but they don't understand that. They have no buckets to put that in terms of their own mental capacity. And so they hide from God because they don't know what's going on. They said, oh, they weren't supposed to eat, but they did eat. Okay. And then this happened. That's a consequence. All right, now, okay, so now they're putting the words together. Now fear. See how fear is able to enter into the picture once evil has come on the scene? Once these things, these emotions now take over. These aren't thoughts, these are emotions. So this whole emotional process has been activated. What's the first thing that God says after? He says, where are you, Adam? Adam, identifies where they're at. And he said, who told you you were naked? I have to look at the scripture and get the direct quote and follow this process. But my point is, he wanted to know who was the one that told them this. Now, it's not like God was Columbo and he needed them to, fess up so we knew who the criminal was, obviously. But I think that's important for posterity to have asked the question, for him to have asked the question so that we have in this narrative who the enemy really is. See, this is for Adam's family. See what I did there? Adam's family. And his descendants, which is you and I. Because the landscape hasn't changed. I don't believe we're born because of Adam's sin, that we are born with a sinful nature. I believe that we sin because we are in a fallen world and we are spiritual and physical beings. We are as spiritual as we are physical. Not 50-50, we're 100, we're 100. And we're physical and spiritual. And Jesus was God and man, so he was physical and spiritual as well. But his spiritual side just happened to be God-flavored. He was God and man. Makes so much more sense. And putting this together now, actually, when you start looking at what's going on in what we're discovering in the realm of quantum physics, and what we know and what we don't know, and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, this all starts to make a little more sense, because from a strictly materialistic standpoint, there are those who are advocating that we are just energy, or we are just this, or we are just that. When you look at the nano level, what's going on in our cells, what's going on in molecules, what's going on in atoms, what's going on at the lowest level component. So we can actually see. And we can see because we have intelligence and we have the ability to do this because we've been created with these attributes from God. So we inherited two things from Adam, I believe. Two things. That's all. Just two. One is our DNA. We are created in his likeness, just like he was created in God's likeness with the ability to reproduce. So we have functionally the DNA of Adam. Yeah, there are variances, and but we're humans, Homo sapiens. However, we've classified that. And genetics show that we all go back to one mother. I think that's really interesting. So we inherit our DNA, and the second thing that we inherit, and this is the crux of the matter, the second thing that we inherit from Adam is our address. And by address, it's simply this: every human being since Adam has lived in the same place. And that same place is not Eden. We're not in Eden. We're in the world. And this world has a negative spiritual influence. And we are spiritual beings. We're open antennas. From the time we're conceived in the womb, we have this as part of our makeup. Our cells, literally all of this is working together. So there's no doubt, it makes sense why we would think it's in us, because why wouldn't we think that? Because that's where it happens. It's what we feel, it's what we see. But what if it's not in us? What if there actually is an external agency that's the prime mover of all of this, of evil? You see how that makes such a critical difference, because at that point, a lot of clarity can come into our hearts and minds if we let it. When we look at human relationships, we look at all of the war and all of the difficulties and all of the hurt and whatever that's been perpetrated on humans, primarily by humans. By far, humans have died by the hands of humans more than probably any other physical phenomenon, whether, geological events, predators. Humans have killed more humans probably than any other thing besides age and so forth. So the only other thing I want to say about this is to tie this up with that the purpose. So why this is important, that's where I want to go to. Why this is important is that when we see this as not being a part of us internally, it's not a part of myself. It's an external influence. That when take away that external influence, I'm just like Adam. I'm just like Eve. I can trust. I can love. I'm free. So you see why the gospel is so important? Jesus makes that possibility a reality, because he demonstrated to us how to do that, and he paved the way for us to be reconciled to God for those infractions, for that sin that we committed against humanity, against our brothers and sisters. So there's that aspect. But then also, if that's the case with me, and then if I have the ability to think abstractly to some degree, existentially to a little bit degree, then I can also then infer that, wait, that person standing over there is in the same situation. They're a human being who's loved by God, who at their core is created in the image of God, but they are under this influence. They are diseased. It's almost like the zombie apocalypse. It really is. It completely is. They're infected, like Loki and Avengers and what's his name? The guy with the bow and arrows. Can't think of his name right now. They both had their minds taken over, and they were working for the bad guys. So, but now, if we externalize this, if we take this away and say, this isn't the case, that opens the door of possibility for reconciliation. So now we have a common enemy, is another way to look at it. Every human is family, and every human has the same enemy who's bent on that human's destruction. So instead of destroying other humans, maybe we should start to think about where the real enemy is and who the real enemy is, and begin to understand the weapons of our warfare a little bit. All right, that's I think that's as far as I want to go with this right now. But to get back, I think it would really be good to have the PowerPoint and to show this as a graph or a chart and a table showing these properties, and then the subsequent points as we go through the narrative here. And I also want to use as an illustration Ed Mondry and Josiah, I think his name was Josiah, at Willow Creek, and the enticement that took place and the innocence of this young boy in that process. That's a perfect picture to me of that validates this entirely, this whole process. So anyway, that's all I have for now.